Welcome back to the studio, guys. Last week we finished this color chart, which charted the three colors we're going to be using for this class plus white. We got cad red or a scarlet red, a yellow ochre, and then an ivory black, and then with some titanium white. We didn't have our oil paint, so we just went to the Dollar Tree and bought some acrylic paint. So we'll be using that to do some quick studies. Before we dive into actually mixing this on a canvas for like a portrait or anything, I wanted to go take a step back and go over some of the really basic concepts of color mixing and color theory. Often color theory can get really complex and I think overly complicated. When it comes to mixing what you see and matching, there's just a few things you want to keep in mind, and it makes it a world easier to find, to like locate a color, identify it, match it on your palette, and then place it down. And that's really what we want to get good at. Color is so relative, so we want to be able to get there pretty quickly and then make adjustments on our painting. One of the first things I like to look at when teaching color, aside from value, so value is the biggest of all. And if we look back at our value chart, that's just the lightness to darkness. And if you can remember, every color has its own kind of value. It's actually more like this. Your yellows will fall kind of into your value 2 range. Reds are more of a mid value. And then your blacks or dark blues kind of fall up into here. So out of the tube, your color is a different value. So you just have to know, if you add yellow to red to make orange, it's no longer a middle value or a light value. It's going to fall somewhere in between that. So every time you're mixing color, you're also changing a value. So value is number one. That's why we spend so much time in drawing and then in monochrome painting. But now, since we're moving into actual color, we need to think about color relationships. And more kind of to that point, so this gets down to these next two, which would be the hue. We talked about this kind of last time. So this was the value, this was the hue, and then amongst that, the other one that changes is the chroma, or like the vibrancy. And a really simple way to think about this is to kind of group these two and to think about the temperature, okay? The color temperature. Many of you might be thinking of the simple kind of color temperature breakdown right down the center here. Warm colors, cool colors. But we can go further than that, because just like color, temperature is so relative. So yes, this is a warm color. Yes, this is a warm color, but compared to this color, it's a cooler color. This is a warm color, but this compared to that, that's a cooler color compared to that. So just like same over here, that's a cool color, that's a cool color. This color compared to that is a warmer color than that. So the two kind of polar opposites are blue and orange. Orange is going to be your warmest color. Blue will be your coolest color. Anytime you move any which direction on that color wheel, left or right, you're going to be changing the temperature. So as you move this direction, that's a yellow, it's a warm color, but it's a cooler version of what you could actually have, right? So you're cooling off that orange, and it's becoming cooler as it moves towards blue. Same over here, you're cooling, so you're never going to get as warm as that. Same, the vice versa. You're adding yellow, so you're adding a warm color into blue, so this color is a cool color, very generally speaking, but it's warmer as it moves towards yellow. So you can see how relative that is. You could like zoom in and take crops out of this, and now you've got a cool color with two warm colors. In the grand scheme of things, it's very cool. So I like to really just break it down to temperature. I have one of the first kind of paintings I did in limited temperature. Idea here was we had two colors plus white. We took ultramarine blue and kind of a burnt sienna. That's the purest color right there, somewhere in here. So you can see how they're directly across, they're warmest and coolest. And all of these grays are mixed in between that. So if you mix your colors, especially complements, blue and orange, red and green, yellow and violet, you get this nice, they mute each other because they kind of cross this gray area. So they start to dull each other. So you get all of these really nice muted colors. Again, I was just using ultramarine blue and burnt sienna, and when they mix, you get a nice gray, plus white to up and down the value a little bit. And it seems like a full color painting, right? If you looked at this, you would assume, oh, that was done in full color, when really it was done in just playing the two temperatures against each other. The same can be done, a little bit more applicable to what we're doing, with flesh, we can just look at the temperature, and that's kind of what I want to do today. So just to reiterate this point, I have this kind of the beginnings of this color chart where it's the same one we made, yellow ochre, cad red, and ivory black, but we get a little bit more, but it's bracketed a little bit further apart. So you can see here, this is a really warm color, this is a really warm color, really cool color. This is a violet, so it's halfway between cool and warm. It's definitely warmer than the ivory black, but definitely cooler than the cad red. So that's how we want to start thinking about color mixing. We want to start by judging the value. Is it a light or dark value? And then is it a warm or cool color? And we throw our best guess in there, and then so if I said, okay, well, it's kind of a violet-y cool color, throw that in there, and it's a dark, like shadow shape, throw this in there, and then I say, okay, well, that's not quite what I see. What do I have to change? I don't say a little bit more yellow, a little bit more green, blah, blah, blah. I say, can it go lighter, darker? Can it go warmer, cooler? If it needs to go a little bit lighter, we go down here. If it needs to go a little bit cooler, we start to get something like that. And that's how we kind of traverse color space. Also keeping in mind that the chroma part, if it needs to be more chromatic, then that tends to be, like if it needs to be more of a chromatic red, then it's going to have to be, you're going to have to be warming it up, and vice versa, more chromatic like blue violet, then it's going to have to go back towards that. So today we're going to take a look at that. We're going to set the acrylics aside. While I was at the Dollar Tree, I picked up some additional supplies, just some of this craft paper. It's really cool. It's almost the exact same stuff that we use in class. This Strathmore, kind of what I draw on the tan toned paper. It's like almost the same, but this whole roll was $1. So pretty affordable. This can go a long way. And then I also picked up some of their colored pencils. So we're going to do a method today called Cran. I think I'm not very good at French, but it basically means 3 crayons or 3 pencils. And we're going to create a believable sense of full color, but really all we're going to be using is black and white pencils, this kind of warm, and so those are our cools. The black and white are going to be our cool colors, and then this tan paper plus a red crayon or a red pencil are going to be our 2 warm colors. So you can see how, in effect, we've got the yellow as the paper, the red pencil, the black pencil, and then the white for the high value, that'll come in from the white pencil. So we're going to get the same effect, but we're not going to be dealing with paint. We're just going to be dealing with judging value and color temperature. I think it'll be a nice ease into painting. Okay, so the idea here is that we're going to limit our colors. We're not going to go, even though this is a pretty limited palette, I find it much easier to just stick to 2. So since we don't have the blue and the orange, which would be the warmest and the coolest, we're going to use something that we can get a believable flesh palette out of. And we will be coming back to the yellow. But I just think as an introduction into the world of color, thinking about color temperature before getting into the whole mixing and matching of every color is a lot easier. And then it kind of folds right into how we want to get really subtle with our color. So we're going to be using the 3 crayon method. Just, you can really use any brown paper, even, you know, if you have like cardstock laying around. This just came some chipboard. You could use that too. I'm just going to cut some of this off, tape it down so it's nice and flat, and that'll be kind of our warm undertone. And then we're going to look for the shadow. We're going to look for the light. And the cool thing about working this method is we start with our drawing and our shadow shape, and then the light becomes the light tone of the paper, and we can push our half tones with our red. And you can see how this matches up, thinking back to that value scale. Each of these colors are kind of inherently colored this way. So we have, for our highlights, we have our white, the red's going to be in the middle, and the black's the shadow. So when we break down the image, or reference image, we can separate the light and shadow, tone the half tones, where you can see we get a lot of the reds and stuff coming out of the shadow, a lot of the half tones, the ruddiness comes through, and then, you know, the light of the paper is right in here somewhere, and then we'll hit the highlights. So I'll go over a little bit of technique of kind of colored pencil on toned paper. But really the big takeaway for this week is thinking in color temperature rather than kind of anything further in color theory and mixing. Because this is going to be the basis for getting all the subtle mixes and tones. And when we get into capturing the exact tones we want, that's kind of the route we want to take. So I'm going to tape this down, and then I'm going to go ahead and just do a little proportional drawing. I think we're just going to make this pretty easy introduction, so I don't want to get into a portrait right now. So let's just focus on kind of the secondary form that often appears in portraiture, the hand. You know, in traditional portraiture, you often see it kind of resting on an armchair, or even in like contemporary portraiture, you often see it interacting with an object or holding something up close to the face. So it'll be good practice. You can never draw or paint too many hands. And I just think I'll choose a really simple pose, and it'll be an easy kind of breakdown of light, shadow, halftone, temperature, and warms, and then highlights. And then we can apply it to something more complex like a portrait if you like. So you can see I just constructed it how we usually do a drawing, general to specific, straight lines to more curved lines, kind of focusing on the lights and shadows, trying to look for the separation of the lights and dark shapes, and then looking at if it's a soft transition or more of a sharp transition. We kind of get a little bit more sharper transition on some of these bony landmarks, like the knuckles get a little bit sharper, but in general it's all pretty soft. I chose this hand or this fist position just because it was kind of simple. We didn't get into all the digits. We can just focus kind of on the light shadow and then the nice transition from kind of a cool shadow to some of the warm undertones of the skin, to the color of the paper, local tone of the paper, and then the highlight for the white chalk, just because it was easy. You guys can choose whichever. You guys could jump into a portrait if you want. I thought this would just be an easier kind of attack to practicing with these. Now the key when we move from, we're going to be moving towards the lightest. We kind of laid in and we kind of assigned where our shadow shapes are, maybe look at where some of our deepest darks are. I think it's going to be in here in these occlusion shadows. Maybe this could be also considered a deep dark. Here I kind of did some linear quality on the outside, which might break down a little bit of the realism, but just to make it a little bit more clear about where the contour was, I decided to do that. Okay, now we're going to move into the halftones. We're going to be kind of building up in value towards our lights. And the key with colored pencil on toned paper is that you kind of want to really have a nice control and a plan of attack for your values. So kind of the same approach we always do, light and shadow is a great way to start that. And then when you start to look at your halftones, you want to be looking at where we can pull those out of the shadows, and then we get to the white of the paper, or in this case the tone of the paper, which is going to be a lot of your halftone because it gives a nice halftone value. And then you want to keep by the time we get this pulled out, we shouldn't have too much of this color bumping into where our highlights are going to be or our white chalk. The reason for that, we can do a little demo over here. So if we started to pull this out, we pull out some of the halftones, even if we were just using black and white chalk. So say you have a shadow shape right here, and then you're pulling out all your halftones, and then you go and you lay in your highlight. It's all good and well until this starts mudding with this, and you get this kind of weird, cool, milky gray effect. And it doesn't allow the paper to breathe. And so that's a key kind of influence of this temperature color shift or color temperature relationships, is that you're covering up all of that warmth, and if you're not letting any of it show through, so you're not getting that scintillation, that vibration of the warm, cool, what's happening is you're going all cool. And so you get this muddy, murky, milky effect, and it kind of kills the life out of the painting. So this is why just thinking about cool, warm, and then transitioning this into the warm of the paper and then keeping that separate from the cool of your highlight is going to be a great way to practice this color relationships. And we're going to also be practicing our color pencil techniques on toned paper. So it's kind of a BOGO this week. So we've established our light darks. Now I'm going to be looking, I've established this base tone for my shadow shapes, kind of keeping an eye on my reference, trying to keep this nice and flat, except where I pushed it deep dark. Now if we look into the shadows, we kind of see variation, right? And so the first variation is this value, so it goes a little bit darker. Some places it starts to get lighter. The other thing we can start to look for, instead of all of this going down the list, we can just look for shifts in temperature, because we've already done the hard work of separating light and shadow. So now where it separates a little bit, maybe up here, doesn't get all that much, maybe a little bit darker. But then it also, you can see, kind of gets warm as it pulls out of that shadow shape into the halftone. And that halftone is getting, it's darker than maybe the light of the paper, so I can extend this. And this is nice because it's a nice mid-tone color down there. Same thing kind of along here, along this crease. Maybe getting a little bit of like a core shadow running down that crease. Get some warmth right there, rolling out onto that. Look for the knuckles especially. That's where you're going to get a lot of that ruddiness coming through. So get this kind of core shadow right on that knuckle. And then a lot of warmth coming out of there and rolling up onto the bony part of the knuckle, but where the light's kind of flooding in and it's not lost in the shadow. I also see some back here. I don't know how far I want to push that, just because I kind of want the attention to stay up here. So by not pushing the chroma or the contrast so heavy back there, we kind of keep the focus over here. Now when we get into here, I'm kind of looking at the reference. It gets quite cool up in here. As far as local tone goes, if we're looking at like this area compared to, say, this area, there, this might be a little bit darker than this area, but more so, it's a lot cooler. So if we need to push this a little bit darker than the tone of the paper, we could just take this light, cool color and just with a little bit of light touch kind of darken it to roll it back to the value we want. But I'm not using the red because I don't want it to go warm. Whereas up in here, where I kind of want to push, maybe not as warm as up there, but just a little bit warmer than the local tone, we can just do a light kind of shading, and that's going to bump the value back a little bit and add a little bit of warmth. So now these are getting close to the same value, but now we're looking at the temperature difference. Other places of heat that you're really going to see in the human figure are going to be like the creases. So in here, where you might think like your deepest dark is going to be like jet black, usually blacks are pretty cool in color, so you want to come in and add some red, or like what I was using was that transparent red oxide in the oil painting, just to give it some depth, but also to retain the heat, because right, the light's bouncing in there, and there's just a lot of kind of blood rushing through. So if you put a dark, cool dark on there, it kind of defeats that purpose of all the warmth bouncing around in there, and it makes it look like a dead hole, where you kind of want to look like just a crease on a human figure. So even if we can't go as dark as maybe our reference suggests, having a little bit of heat in there is going to make it more believable. So I kind of got the value with the black, and now I'm kind of losing a little bit of it because the red's a little bit lighter, but at least it's warming it up, so it's not just a cold dead hole in there. And then we'll pull out some of the halftones in red. Same thing up here. Starting with those creases. This is a great example. There's a lot of ruddiness in this finger. And this is really what it becomes all about. It's kind of like a little game almost of Sudoku, I like to compare it to, because once you have your proportional drawing down, easy enough, then we go into our lights and darks, and then it's just about how do those light averages and dark averages kind of vary within themselves, and then how do they merge. And all to get those answers to those questions, all you have to do is ask yourself, okay, from the average I have, maybe coming down here along this core shadow, what's happening? It's getting darker. Is it getting cooler or warmer? It's staying fairly, the temperature's staying fairly constant. Now, as it creeps down towards here, it's getting lighter than this core shadow, so I need to ease up the pressure, but it's also starting to fill with a little bit more warmth, and so I need to switch to maybe this to get a little bit of value. And I would say how I'm doing it in here, you can kind of mix the red and black a little bit. It actually gives you some nice violets. Like I see kind of the blue undertones in here, but I'm also seeing a little bit of violet, so I think mixing this just subtly is okay. That's different than when we pull from the halftones into the highlight. We don't want to mix any of these two colors with white. It'll just give us this murky effect. So I'm going to put this down. I'm not going to even save this to end. You want to push this as far as you can with your halftones. You want this to be able to read pretty well, and that's kind of like the cherry on top. Down here, this is super dark, but I also feel like compared to my reference, it got a little bit cold. And then you can see now that we were starting to get some like hue and value down all around on here. You can see kind of the yellow flecks of color pop off the reference kind of in here, and that's where I'm just going to leave the yellow of the paper. If I had a true yellow paper, like kind of a pale Naples yellow, it would be more effective, but I think, for $1 at the Dollar Tree, it's hard to beat, right? It's still good practice for temperature and value control. Squint, squint, squint. I see that this halftone isn't that warm, so I'm going to go in with the black and kind of extend it out of the shadow shape. I'm giving a little bit of volume to the wrist. A lot of round forms, so not a ton of sharp edges, just kind of these linear details are going to be some of your sharpest lines. Everything else we can keep fairly soft. I love this. I keep wanting to say pose, but just this, what the hand is, the shapes the hand is making, because it gives us just this one finger to worry about. I think when we have to deal with all these fingers, even when they're like this, we tend to focus on drawing the finger and getting the proportions right, and then they just look like outlines, which is terrible. So the key to make fingers look realistic is to get all the shadow shapes right. So you can see how tiny that light shape is on there compared to how big this light shape is. It's such a small amount of actual finger that's out in the light. So much of it falls into shadow. If you were just to draw this the same width as this, like it's in full light, it's going to look way too big. So take into account your light and shadow, and then furthermore your halftone. So no matter if you get your proportions 100% correct in your line drawing of this, it's not going to look right until you add this light halftone shadows to each one. So it shows the roundness and it kind of slims them up. So what I like about this one is it really does that, but just on this one section we have to worry about. But you can see how you really have to push these halftones, make this kind of roll out of this highlight area where the light's hitting directly into that shadow. And that's what gives it its believability. Now a little bit of light is creeping right there. Right here, so I'm going to pull it out because I don't want, if I have to go in for a highlight, I don't want the white chalk mixing. And this kind of wraps down quite lightly in value to there. So don't be afraid to come in and erase out stuff because you don't want it to mix in the end. And I just take the very much the same approach in paint. I work on the drawing first, lay down my average kind of guesses, and then look at how those guesses alternate as they kind of merge into one another. trying to get closer in correct value and correct temperature. The other cool part about thinking in temperature, aside from just a lot easier to match, is that if you can gain or achieve an accurate sense of value and temperature in your drawing, color is really interpretive. So we all see color a little bit differently, and for that reason, you can't pin it down to say what's right or wrong. And even the same person sees it differently because it's so relative. Time to time, depending on what's surrounding the object. So that just means you have a lot of flexibility when it comes to the actual color of something and its correctness. The more important thing is the drawing, proportional drawing, and the separation of light and dark. I'm going to keep that ready, but cool this down a little bit. And then the temperature relationships. Cool, warm, and then we're going to work back to the cool of the highlight. And if you can get those relationships right, that's all you really need. You can kind of make up the color. And that's very much what I was doing, and I touched on it really just super briefly when we were talking about abstraction for the background of that self-portrait I was doing with the floral in the background. I was abstracting it. All I was looking for was the shapes of the leaves and then lightness or darkness. So where there was kind of like sunlight hitting it, I could go lighter. Where there was, leaves were covering leaves, I could go darker. And then I could just look for the variation within the leaf of warm, kind of yellowy greens and cool bluey greens. That's all I was doing, was trying to find those big relationships and then simplifying them. And that's how I kind of was abstracting that background. That's one route for abstraction. But then it still kind of hints at a believable background. Okay, so I'm just kind of trying to sneak these up a little bit. Still trying to let the paper breathe as much as I can. I have a tendency to kind of over halftone things. I think we all do a little bit. So just knowing it's all right. If not all the paper is covered. Down here, get some more redness, I think, in the pad of the thumb. The nail's quite warm. Okay, so I'm just going to keep pushing this a little bit further. I think I'm going to speed it up because I'm not saying anything new. Big ideas there. Separation of light and dark. Give it a nice average tone with your black, and then look at pulling out of that shadow into your light areas. Again, you don't have to do this hand. You can do your own hand. That's the other reason I chose the hand, is that you can model with your own non-dominant drawing hand. And then look for how that color changes, knowing that you can't match all the violets and blues and stuff. We don't even have blue. We've got black, so we're just looking for warmer or cooler as we move into the halftones. So I'm going to speed it up. I'm going to just kind of fine-tune this a little bit, and then I'll jump back in before I put down the halftone or the highlights with the white. Okay, so I did just a little bit more kind of subtle refining, just kind of pushing and pulling, especially in regards to value. Some of the spots I got a little bit too dark with, so I pulled back to the brown of the paper. Same thing in a lot of these spots where there was a lot of mid-tones and stuff. I just tried to let the paper breathe. I think that's super important. Especially this stage, it's a little bit more forgiving. As soon as we get white on there, it's a little bit harder to erase. It just kind of smears. So you want to really get wherever you think you're going to put your highlights. And in general, for this technique, you really want to keep this white separated from all the other colors. There is some gorgeous artists that do some blending or mixing of it. Let's see this. So a friend of mine, Dave Casson, And for the most part, though, he's still kind of sticking to that rule of keeping the whites separate from the blacks, or in our case, the reds and the blacks, and using the tone of the paper to come through to give those half tones, and then the lights just stay separate. He has such a delicate touch, though. He can go in here and kind of go over some of the charcoal marks with the white, but in general, you kind of really want to keep them separate, unless you have like the finest of finest touch. Just a good rule of thumb to keep them separated. So what I did was pulled out a lot of the color and tone for my halftone, so that way when I go in, I just hit these really minimal marks with highlights, really squinting down through the whole process, but especially now, and just finding like these key ridges. Maybe right through here, where we can get that highlight, and then kind of just soften it into the halftone. I don't want it to be too drastic. Same thing here. I'm using kind of just the side of the pencil lead. What I was doing in the sped up video too was to get some of these really drastic warms. I was actually using, I kind of went to more of the tip of the pencil. But it was all, I snuck up on that. You know, I didn't go straight in with the straight hard pressure red to get these kind of brilliant warms. I built up to that. Maybe this. I always have a tendency to push this light a little bit too far. I'm still learning, but let's just kind of leave it minimal at this point. Just kind of catching the most lit ridges of these wrinkles. And then I'm going to stop before I do too much more up there. In this case, it's almost good to have a dual pencil because then you don't have a tendency to get any sharp lines. I can already see it's picking up a little bit of the red, so it's getting a little bit, kind of giving me a pinky, milky color, which I don't want, so I'm just trying not to do that. There we go. Now we're getting some nice subtlety. So this is going to tune your eye for temperature, but also value. And the difference here is that it's kind of like you have to decide and commit to your value pattern, because I can't go in now and say, oh, you know, this needs to be a little bit lighter and do this, because it's going to destroy, it's going to create that milky, gross color, and it'll destroy the color. So what I did was decided where my shadows were, my halftones, and now my highlights, and I have to stick with that. So it's going to hone not only your color temperature relationships, but also your dedication to your value pattern, which we'll be practicing more in the next exercise as well. Just a few more highlights. I see it kind of catching right along this ridge. Just squinting to see where I need it most. This kind of gets light, but I'm also seeing that it's pretty yellow, so I don't really want to destroy the warmth of the paper there by putting too much white chalk down. And maybe this creeps down here. Now, you could argue that there's a lot of white to the local tone in general, but since we're trying to stick true to a strong value pattern, I don't want to spread this throughout. Okay, that just about, I think, does it. Maybe a little catch back here. But any more and it's going to start blending, I think. So with 3 colors, 3 crayons, and some toned paper, you kind of have a believable sense of reality, even though it's a very limited, almost, you could call it monochromatic because it's just black and white, or achromatic, black and white plus a color. But we have kind of an an illusion of a full color drawing or painting. So go ahead, and the materials for this was just $1 for the pencils and $1 for the paper, and that paper is a couple meters long, so you can do a ton of drawings. These pencils will last you forever, and then we already had the eraser. You can see I did slip a few sheets of paper under here just to add some nice padding, which I think helped. All right, so next time, practice this to ease your way into color as a nice introduction, not to really color mixing, but to temperature, like realization and identification. And then we will move into the 3 colors in acrylic paint next time.